Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
I think for Sayers, the church was not as strongly rooted in doctrine as she wanted. And so I think, and I mean, there might be a way to connect it to nice, where it's like, okay, we go to church, it's the thing to do.
Because we're nice.
We're nice, right? This is what you do as, the good English woman. You go to church on a Sunday and you kind of go through the motions. And for Sayers, going through the motions, that's something that she was never able to do.
Welcome to the Wade podcast. I am delighted this morning to welcome Christine Colón, whose recent book, Choosing Community, was the result of the Wade Hansen lectureship that is sponsored by the Wade Center, where we encourage Wheaton professors to study one of the 7 authors we archive here at the Wade, present lectures with respondents, and then the final result is made into a book published by InterVarsity Press. And she has done a wonderful job of getting us to think about Sayers in a new way. Joining us is one of the respondents to Christine's book, Tiffany Kriner, and I am delighted to have her here because Tiffany was one of my students at Messiah College, and now she is an extremely well-respected professor in the English department at Wheaton, as is Christine Colón. So, Tiffany and Christine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
It's so good to be here and to be back with my mentor.
Oh, yay. Well, and I met Christine before I came to Wheaton because we were at a conference in Lille, France together, and then a conference at Baylor, wasn't it?
Right. We were at a film conference at Baylor.
Yes,
so,
yeah. So there's a lot of connections.
Yes, we happen to overlap quite often with Victorian things, with interest in film. So
yes.
Lots of connections.
In fact, I've told Christine she and I are the same person. We have so many similar interests. So I wonder, Christine, if you could just summarize for us in just a short paragraph the thesis behind your book, Choosing Community.
Sure. It's really a look at the various ways that Sayers deals with the challenges of community in her works. I was really excited to be able to look not only at her detective fiction, but also her religious plays, and really looking at, I think, 3 main things that I see her doing in her work. Really valuing communities of action, where groups come together and work together to solve problems, but also communities of faith that are really held together by key principles. And then communities of joy. One of the things I loved about this project was really diving into those moments in Sayers' life and her letters where she is expressing her joy for living. And I think that's something that we often don't pay attention to, not only not in Sayers, but in our own lives. What does it mean to really embrace joy in community? So I trace those themes through various works that Sayers wrote.
Our producer, Aaron Hill, who's in the room with us, he and I were having a conversation before the podcast started about the whole issue of relationship and the theology of relationship. Let's talk, before we start pursuing the specifics of this idea of community, as to why you two think that everybody in the English-speaking culture has heard of Agatha Christie, but hardly anybody has heard of Dorothy Sayers, and especially her detective fiction, because both of you write about her detective fiction in this book. Any theories?
Do you want to go first with that?
Well, I actually haven't read Agatha Christie. I mean,
that's a great answer.
For good reason, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think of my own background as an evangelical. I think I took a course in college that first introduced me to Sayers' work through the 9 Taylors in theology and Oxford Christian writers. And that was my first introduction. And I remember then taking out a book of her letters and reading some more. And then, book by book, working my way through Sayers' work. And it's funny, maybe there's a kind of classicness or a formulaicness to the Christie novels that make them sort of consumable. Whereas there's a little bit more of a challenge. But of course, I'm speaking a little bit as someone who doesn't know as well Christie's work. So if I had to guess, it would be the challenge of it. And I mean, at some point in our conversation, I kind of want to talk about Sayers' personality as related to her fiction. One of the great realizations of Christine's book for me was just diving into the personality of a writer who values community so much, but at the same time, it's kind of hard-hitting.
She tells people what she thinks of them.
Yeah.
She does not let them off easy.
I felt, and for a long time, I read Gaudy Night practically every year, just exploring its view of women scholars and people doing the work to which they are called. And these are really attractive ideas to me. But at the same time, I couldn't help but feel, reading her letters and that book over and over, that she maybe wouldn't have liked me or wouldn't, would have judged or something. Like, I felt her as a judgy presence. And I wonder, and you can cut any of this out, but I was just wondering if her personality might have something to do with it, which is an awkward thing to say. So maybe you should just take it all out. But I guess I mean that, Walter Hansen's introduction to your book quoted Barbara Reynolds saying she's brilliant, erratic, rude, and impatient. And I was super interested in that characterization of her. On the one hand, I think, how unfair a woman to be characterized like this. But on the other, I don't know. Did it affect her audience? You'll know way better.
Well, I know that Christine, that Tiffany, you and I are probably more alike because we got into Sayers because of our interest in Christianity and literature. Whereas Christine, I know that you value detective fiction as a genre on its own.
I do. Yeah. I read Agatha Christie much earlier than reading Sayers. And so I think, for me, Agatha Christie is much more the standard writer of detective fiction. And I think part of the reason why she is kind of the go-to person when you think about, the detective novel, particularly in the height of the detective novel. So, the 30s, 40s, and 50s. One reason why I think we go to her is she wrote so many more. And so there are so many more to draw from. Also, hers tend to be much more of the standard mystery, so they're a lot easier to adapt to television drama, to movies. And I think particularly now, a lot of people will come to Agatha Christie through, seeing it on, Masterpiece Mystery or some kind of adaptation, and then go to the novels. And while there have been adaptations of Sayers novels, they're harder to adapt, particularly the later novels, because they're so much more complex.
Right.
Sayers is doing much more with them than simply, here's the standard mystery. And so I think that makes her a little bit more difficult to put into that tradition. Though
she's not formulaic. In fact, she changed.
Right.
Some theorists of the detective genre says she changed the genre.
Right. Though interestingly, on lists of the surveys they take about best mystery novel ever, Nine Tailors in particular usually rises to the top.
Interesting.
And so in those kinds of things, she's acknowledged, but kind of in the popular audience, it's much easier, I think, to connect with Agatha Christie.
They're consumable, maybe, in a way.
I think so.
There's a certain type of insatiability to a reader of genre fiction, right? Like the YA fantasy, romance, all these sort of categories. And one gets done then.
Predictable formulas.
Comforting. It's going to work out in X or Y way. And we're going to figure out some neat scientific tidbit, or something like that.
Yeah, so Christine, you mentioned Nine Tailors, and that is the focus of your discussion in one of your chapters. So why don't you tell us how community operates in Nine Tailors?
Yeah, in the Nine Tailors, though interestingly, I spend more time on Nine Tailors in my academic book on Sayers. And I kind of spend more time on Strong Poison in choosing community. But Nine Tailors is actually one of my favorites. When I think about her detective fiction, I go back and forth between Nine Tailors and Gaudy Night, and it depends what mood I'm in. If I'm in the mood for like the more standard detective novel, it's Nine Tailors. If I want more of the character and the novelistic qualities of it, I go to Gaudy Night. But I think with Nine Tailors, so much of the interest of that novel is the fact that the detective, Lord Peter Wimsey, comes to this small town where he is such the fish out of water in certain ways. In other ways, he fits in really nicely, but has to really enter into the rhythms of that small town in order to solve the mystery. He can't solve it as the outsider. He has to come in and be a participant in it. And so particularly the way it ends, which I won't give away, it all depends on him being in community with the people in this town. And so I think it's really significant that Sayers, in so many of her novels, really draws us into the value of community and the ways that every individual in that community participates in an interesting way in the resolution of the mystery.
And your metaphor of the change ringers is perfect for that, right? That every person who rings the bells has to know the exact moment to ring the bell of choice. And you have to learn long, complicated bits and do your part just so in order to make it work. And I just loved that opening image.
And I love the fact that Lord Peter participates, even though, what is it, 8 hours that they're ringing the bells? I forget how many hours it is, but this is hard labor and they're sweating. They're all in this bell tower and just following the pattern to make this particular change work. And Wimsey doesn't think, well, I'm an aristocrat. I don't have to do this. So he is such a great example of Sayers' famous line, the only Christian work is good work well done. And Lord Peter Wimsey, though not religious, is committed to good work well done rather than protectivism of his aristocratic privilege.
Right. And that's what I love about him stepping into this community. He is able to participate in the bell ringing, which is kind of the ultimate example of community, where the thing that I find fascinating about change ringing is the fact that everybody has to pay attention to everybody else. You have to come in precisely at the right moment. And, it's not, if you start just thinking about yourself and you forget, wait, what's the pattern? Where is everybody else? That throws everyone else off, And so I love the fact that he comes into the community there. I love the fact there's this great scene in the novel where he's sitting in the church and he's looking up at the roof of the church and seeing the carvings of angels there and just realizing just the beauty of that and entering into the beauty of kind of the church building and that community. And so there are all these lovely moments in the novel that really emphasize how he's being drawn into this community.
Well, and that expands the community because the community entails the people who built the church and carved these gorgeous angel roofs. Good work, well done, once again. I think that, and I've argued this in one of my books, is that Sayers identifies with Lord Peter Wimsey as much as she identifies with Harriet Vane, and we're going to have to get into her in a bit related to Tiffany's essay. But just you throw yourself into the job that the whole community is drawn to. And that's why Sayers loved theater so much. And you have a chapter on theater, right?
Yes.
So that here is Sayers who wrote the plays, and she could stand back somewhat like the aristocratic privilege of authorship and say, well, I wrote the play. Now, you guys go ahead and put it on. But she was there every single day. She was like ringing the bells as Lord Peter did, and she was helping mend costumes and fix bits of the stage and responding to questions. This was a community project.
Yes. And, for someone like Sayers, who was so committed to the integrity of her own work, I think what's really striking in the plays that she wrote and her participation was that she was willing to rewrite things. If she saw that something wasn't working for the actors, she recognized, okay, it's they're doing their job well. If this isn't working, I need to find a way to help them and to make it work.
Right.
And she recognized in theater that, yes, this is communal. And she never got on her high horse as long as it was something that was related to the work. If it was something where it was clear the actors knew what they were doing and her lines weren't working for the actors, she would be happy to change it. If it was some other external force, she would say no.
Right. Like when BBC Radio asked her to dumb down her radio plays about Jesus.
Precisely. Right. She would not cave to that.
She tore up her contract and mailed it back to them. And she was not going to change her work. But that was because they weren't responding on the level of good work, well done.
Right.
They were just pandering to their sense of what audience wanted.
Right. And they were trying to tell her what her good work should look like.
Right.
As opposed to, the actors who were doing their own good work and trying to figure it out. And she was willing to recognize, oh, okay, this isn't working as well for them. Let's adjust it.
And this gives good examples to go back to what Tiffany was talking about. I felt the same way you did, Tiffany, when I started reading Sayers, and she just got away with being bumptious and even to the point where it seems like she would insult someone because they had insulted her. And I realized how I had been so brought up to be nice.
That's exactly it.
And the problem where often Christians define Christian ethics as niceness, whereas sometimes if you're standing up for an issue, niceness isn't the correct response. And of course, there's gender issues going on there. That's why I like to think of Sayers as identifying as much with Lord Peter Wimsey as she does with the love interest that she invents for him.
Well, and both Lord Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane find community in places other than the church, right?
Yes.
And I was really interested in the way that theater provides a kind of community that, as you point out, the church really doesn't for her. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Why you think, yes, theater, not so much the church? Is the church infected with nice for Sayers? Or what is really going on with that?
I think for Sayers, the church was not as strongly rooted in doctrine as she wanted. And so I think... And I mean, there might be a way to connect it to nice, where it's like, okay, we go to church. It's the thing to do.
Because we're nice.
We're nice, right? This is what you do as, the good Englishwoman. You go to church on a Sunday and you kind of go through the motions. And for Sayers, going through the motions, that's something that she was never able to do. I mean, one of the things I love about Sayers is she throws herself into everything. When she's writing the Nine Tailors, she is going to make sure she knows how to do change ringing in her head and study all of the ways to do it. So she knows how to do it before she writes it. And so she really, I think, had problems with the church because it's like you're going to church and you don't even know what you believe. And so because there wasn't that commitment, I think that's what really frustrated her about the church. And so when she looked at theater and she saw, okay, everybody's coming together in their commitment to this play and they're all working towards it and they all have that goal. She's like, this is what we should be doing in the church. We should have that foundation of here's what we believe, and then we should step up and do something about it. And she really didn't see that in the church communities that she was looking at in England.
They weren't doing a good enough job at their work, their doctrinal work.
Right.
And is that the primary work of the church for her, doctrine? I'm thinking, for example, that we might describe the work of the church in lots of ways, right? As to embody love, for example, or something like that. And while she probably wouldn't say doctrine is separated from love, yet is that her focus?
I think it is her focus for that time. I think that she felt that particularly after World War II, that things are serious here. And we as a church need to come together to have a response so that we can rebuild society after the devastation of war. And I mean, particularly, it always strikes me as so important to remember that Sayers also had lived through World War I, and thinking about that generation where it's like, okay, we've gone through the Great War. We thought we pulled it together. We thought that, we're moving ahead. And then here comes World War II. Just that realization of, okay, we need to do a better job here. We can't keep having these world wars, every, so often. And so I really get the sense that for Sayers at that time, doctrine was really the key to jumpstart then the action of the church from that.
Well, as you would have in Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, about the body has many members, but can the foot say to the eye, I don't need you? And she saw that worked out in theater because the actor, even the lead role actor on stage, can't say to the lighting technician, I don't need you. Because if the light isn't on you, and no matter how good your acting is, it won't work. And so theater represented for her what she saw the best church doing. And I think a lot of people, as soon as you think of church as something that nice people go to, it's not about thinking of community and how we all have a role to play as the body of Christ. It's just going through the motions. And I really do think I know she was disgusted how many Christians she ran into who didn't even know the basic doctrine of Christianity. So it wasn't church was about protecting doctrine. It's first we have to know what the central core of our mission is. Just like a theater troupe, if everybody hasn't read the play, if everybody doesn't know what the play is, it's going to be a mess up.
Right. Well, and it's just, reading through Sayers' letters and her responses to people, so often when she was writing about doctrine, she would get responses from people who would say, wow, that's such an interesting idea that you have come up with.
Right.
And Sayers started to get really frustrated. And, it's like, I'm not coming up with these ideas. Look at the creeds. This is, what we are supposed to believe, not something that I have just simply, discovered on my own.
No, but that's the work of Sayers as a theologian also, right? To say doctrine truly and well at a particular time in a particular place. And that seems to me, that she shouldn't downplay that piece of it, right? Like, I didn't invent it, right? It's orthodoxy, but theology reinforces orthodoxy, right? Like, or helps it to come out at a particular time and place when it is so needed.
Well, that is relevant to your essay, Tiffany, because you are talking about the importance of place in this one novel. So Tiffany's essay in this book of lectures, Choosing Community, focuses on Sayers' 1932 novel, Have His Carcass. And you did this fantastic reading. You helped me see things in that novel. I've read that novel probably 5 times, but I just so enjoyed your emphasis on place. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Is this something you've been thinking about and so you saw it in Sayers? Or did you just read this novel and become impressed with what is happening in terms of place?
Well, so I came to the novel basically wanting to try to operationalize the reading that Christine had done of Sayers' developing work. She was seeing Sayers developing communities of action. And I was really excited about her reading and especially about seeing Sayers' development. And I thought, well, okay, we have communities of action in Sayers. I wonder what it would be like to try to make that happen in our lives and in our community. And I'm a literary scholar, so I have a certain number of methodologies available to me. Close reading is one of the things that we do. And so I thought,
wonder where you learned that, Tiffany. Excuse me.
From my best professor ever. So I decided to try and close read one of Sayers' novels from the period that Christine was describing in order to see whether Sayers herself might offer us some ideas about how to put into motion communities of action. I do confess that I think about place a great deal in my own work, especially in the last few years. But it seemed to me that reading Havis Karkas closely helped me see how attention to bodies and attention to place were the key ways in which the members of the community pursued the action that they really needed to solve the murder, to reestablish or even try to establish the semblance of relationships in that community, and even Harriet and Peter working in their own relationship at the same time.
Well, I want you both to know that you helped me see Harriet Vane, whom Sayers invented, basically, as she tells us, to marry Peter off and get rid of him. She was getting sick and tired of Peter Whimsy, his insufferable breeziness, I think she describes it. And this could go back to our Agatha Christie or my Agatha Christie question. Insofar as you read works about Agatha Christie, she was getting sick and tired of Pato, is that how you pronounce his name? But she kept him going because he was a source of income. And what I respect about Sayers is that she wasn't going to perpetuate something that she felt was no longer fertile, even if it meant less income through sales for her. So she invented Harriet Vane to marry Peter off, get rid of him. But then she liked Harriet Vane so much, she goes, I got to change Peter to make him worthy of marrying this fascinating woman. So, wow. I mean, when have you ever heard of an author doing something like this? But until I read this book and both of you, your essays in this book, it hadn't occurred to me how part of Harriet Vane's problem was her lack of community. And I think any author can feel that. If you're going to be an author, you need, as Virginia Woolf tells us, a room of one's own. A room of one's own means you shut community out. And you might have intellectual community insofar as you have people that you're reading. But wow. Christine, thank you for helping me see how this issue of the healing that was necessary for Harriet Vane's life was helping her return to embrace community. And part of that is returning to Oxford, where she had her last experience of community. It was really interesting. And community deals with place, right? Communities meet in particular places. So that's why, Tiffany, your essay dovetailed so well with what Christine was doing.
Well, and even the place in, when you're thinking about Harriet's healing and the place of Oxford, it's with regard to community. She finds intellectual community in the Women's College as she returns. But even as a writer, when she does her study of Sheridan Le Fanu, she's finding scholarly community at that same time. Yes. And that's a piece of that. When she's not able to work yet on the one sticky character that she really needs to complicate, she pursues that scholarly project, which sort of brings her back.
That's a great point. Whereas writing detective fiction, since it's popular literature, you aren't in a scholarly community. You are just autonomously writing this book. And I wonder if Sayers herself, as she was writing detective fiction, I mean, she was writing it basically for the income. And you wonder if she missed that community that she herself had at Oxford called the Mutual Admiration Society, where she collected around herself other women's students, and they would respond to each other's writing. So Sayers originated something that everybody else is familiar with in terms of C.S. Lewis, the Inklings. Well, Sayers had an Inklings community as a college student, but then she lost it. And it's almost like...
But she did have the detection club.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
And I think,
but not till 1930.
Right. But I think it's interesting that she was so involved in the detection club, because
Yes.
I think that's one of the things that really struck me writing on community was it really caused me to think about where that appeared for Sayers, and when she didn't have it, how she tried to create it. Because she was completely invested in the detection club and was frustrated with people who weren't invested.
Right.
Agatha Christie being one of them, actually. There are some
Right.
pretty funny letters where she's trying to get a hold of Agatha Christie because Christie had promised them something and wouldn't get back to them. And for Sayers, it's really, if you're part of the community, be part of the community. And so I think it's interesting that she did seem to have those lean years without community, but then with the detection club jumped into that. But I do think it's one of the reasons why that transition for her from writing detective fiction to writing plays was so appealing, because it compelled her to be in community for each one of those productions. And she, I think, loved that. That's another reason why it wasn't the type of playwright to write the play and then send it off and let other people deal with it. She wanted to be there at the rehearsals. She wanted to engage with the director. She wanted to engage with the actors. She wanted to help out with the costumes and the props.
Right.
Because that's the world she loved. She loved community.
Well, it reminds me of Tiffany's question about church, because the detection club ceremonies were very liturgical. They had a set piece that they pronounced as part of their ceremony. They had a skull named Eric they would bring in on a cushion, and it was part of the joy. And you have a whole section of your book on Sayers' sense of joy, and I really do. You made me realize how it was tied to community, and how interesting that what I see, Sayers' return to a more vibrant faith happened through writing for theater, but about Christianity, because Zeal of the House. So those two things came together, and I see that love of community then enriching her faith. Let's talk about Sayers' joy.
Certainly. I think for me, that was actually one of the best parts of writing this book, being able to just think about joy. And how we can really value relationships with others, not simply in an academic way or in a kind of procedural way. You do your job, I'll do my job, and we'll come together. One of the things I love about Sayers is just the joy that she took in relationships. And so going through her letters and finding the little sketches that she would put in her letters to different people, and just, trying to make them laugh, the inside jokes that they would have. And it was really thinking about how Sayers was enacting joy in her personal relationships through the correspondence, that really took me to the character of Harriet Vane, because I started to think about how little joy Harriet has. And that's really what led me to thinking about her isolation. I mean, the first time we see her is in the interview room in prison. And it really struck me just, you have just this awkward situation of, this woman who's on trial for murder. She's on one side of the table. Lord Peter's on the other side. They have someone watching them through the window, and just the awkward situation there where it's like there's not even community in this, this moment. And that's the most community she gets. I mean, other than that, it's back to her jail cell. And so we meet her at the lowest point of her life. And I started to be really fascinated by the idea of, wait a second, that image is very different from the image we get in Busman's honeymoon.
Right.
And how does she get there? And as I was thinking about how she got there, I realized that Sayers was doing it through community. The community of Oxford that she's able to go back to. But I think even more importantly for me was the discovery of, wait a second, the community, when she decides to go back to the neighborhood that she grew up in, which for Harriet is a big step because she felt like she had disgraced that neighborhood, but the fact that she wants to go back there and finds joy there in that community, it was kind of this light bulb moment for me where I felt like, there's been a lot of scholarship on, Sayers being like Harriet Vane in different ways. And Crystal, I agree with you. I actually think that, yes, there's Sayers in Harriet, but also in Lord Peter. I don't think it's simply,
Yes.
a crafting of, I'll just fictionalize myself and put myself in the stories. But one thing that hadn't been looked at is kind of this growth in joy. And I began to think, what if there is something that Sayers is trying to do with that? And I think it's significant that Sayers links it to community, because I think she herself found joy in community. And so I thought it was interesting that it's like, I think Harriet's doing that as well in the trajectory of the novels.
Well, and so many moments of her growth are associated with play of some kind, right? So you, I think, mentioned in your book the talking piffle comment, right? Where Harriet says, if someone marries you, it's because you talk piffle or to be able to talk piffle with you. And she says, I've gotten out of practice at that. But she gets back into practice.
Right.
I think, for example, of the sonnet that she started to write. And she has this kind of metaphysical sonnet, and he turns the image that she has into a spinning top. So he turns the sonnet into a game. Lay on thy whip so love, right? He says to make the top spin. And to make that game happen, he buys her chess pieces so she can play.
Right.
And as you point out, too, at the end there, the proposal scene, does it please you? Right. And that pleasure as key to her growth is just, it's lovely that they're able to relax. Even the first moment when they have their kind of blushing realization, right? They're punting.
Right.
Right. Just that kind of, and I mean, that's not as much maybe community per se in the sort of larger sense, but it is recreation.
Right. And I find it interesting, thinking about the talking piffle, because that's something that definitely brings Harriet and Lord Peter together, right? They can both quote from literature. They can both, engage at that level. What I find interesting about Busman's honeymoon is the superintendent is brought into that as well. And so it's not simply something that is, just the two of them,
or whatever,
right? I love the fact that it can also, other like-minded people can participate in that. And I love that little thing that Sayers does with that final novel to bring other people in and say, okay, this is, when the police force can engage in piffle as well, this is a good place to settle.
Well, oh man, this is why it was so brilliant of Tiffany to focus on Have His Carcass in her essay, because what you just said, Christine, about our first image of Harriet Vane being isolated in a prison, there's even this window of separation. And then we get so that was in the novel Strong Poison, right? And then we get the Have His Carcass, where she's by herself even hiking. She doesn't even have a partner to go hiking with. And you have this wonderful image, Tiffany, where suddenly she's drawn to awareness because the ocean laps her feet, and it's like the ocean is connecting to her. And so she almost has to be brought back into nature again in the step-by-step process until we get to that moment in the last novel, Bestman's Honeymoon, where she is in community. So I thought your choice, Tiffany, just helped advance this whole book along as Christine was exploring this issue. So I appreciate that.
Well, one of the things I love about the book and continue to enjoy about the book, and why I was glad that my daughter stole my copy as soon as it came into the house, was that even though this is a work of scholarship about Dorothy L. Sayers, and its subtitle, Action, Faith, and Joy in the Works of Dorothy L. Sayers, I do think that it is actionable, that the lessons that it talks about in Sayers, the sort of literary critical insights, are actionable in the life of faith and in the life of the church. And so even though there's nothing about this necessarily that makes for a sermon, I felt the longing to try them out. Right. So when Sayers is practicing these moments of joy in her letters and life, I was moved that, for example, Brian McGraw was respondent when he talked about civic friendship and other kinds of friendship. It just so happens, of course, that McGraw and others have been deeply impacted by the loss of one of our colleagues, Brett Foster, who was gifted in friendship, and the kinds of back and forth play and conversation and shared activities are sort of ways to practice real, true love of the Trinity kinds of community in the world. And I felt like this book moves forward that love of the Trinity, moves forward that kind of thing as we seek to make better communities.
Yes, and that idea with the Trinity, and of course, Sayers was fascinated by the Trinity, but the idea that God is inherently relational. God is God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. Relationality is part of God's nature. And so when we see Harriet Vane isolated in the prison cell, isolated even in nature till the water speaks to her, she is outside, you might say, of God's intended created order, which is to be in relationship. And of course, that's what God wants for us, to be in relationship with us.
And something you're just saying helps solve a question or problem that I've been really wrestling with about Sayers. So Sayers talks about good work well done, right, as this major important thing. And I've always just struggled with, what about bad work poorly done? Or what about when people can't do good work, or their work isn't isn't good enough? One wonders how Sayers would judge any of our works, as if she were the ultimate. I don't mean to say, but, that question. And it seems to me that if the Trinity is her model, of course, it's always good work well done, right? That the Lord is good and does good work. But it also strikes me that being invited into community is a way possibly to heal bad work, which is to say, if we think about Harriet in Gaudy Night, for example, as, struggling with one of her novels. She tends to be sort of good at this, but there's a problem with one of her characters. Then the community itself becomes, through her relationship with Peter, through the solving of the mystery, all sorts of, reconnections with other people in that community. It helps her to improve her work and become a better writer. And I think that's comforting to me because I've just wondered who can live up to the standard of good work well done. Only the geniuses who are building the cathedral, who have their flaws, no doubt, but who are unquestionably good at their work. And while Harriet does say, I'm rather good at it, about her work as a detective novelist, she's at least struggling. And there's a kind of solution there. So I don't know. I'm not sure what it is in what you were just saying that just made me think of that. But the Trinity may be the model for good work well done, but the Trinity invites participation into it, from all of us. And so,
yeah. And of course, her very model of creativity is based on the Trinity and mind of the Maker.
Right.
So I think to answer that question you just raised, Tiffany, there might be something about our awareness of this tripartite element of our own Trinitarian work, and that we have idea, energy, power, like Father, Son, Holy Ghost, but to think, no, it's just me and my genius, and not realize the importance of audience. So there's community again. So even the connection to realize I am not autonomous. And that is an essential truth that all Christians need to realize. None of us are autonomous. And of course, Sayers was living at a time where high modernism was totally about autonomy, that you do not connect to anybody. The genius transcends the mass of humanity and creates these works that the populace can't understand. And Sayers did not like that. And it ties into this idea of community, the community of the Godhead itself.
That's one of the reasons why I love the fact that Lord Peter Wimsey is surrounded by people who are essential to helping him. The role of Bunter.
Yes.
Lord Peter literally would not have survived without Bunter helping him through his post-traumatic stress disorder. Or his relationship with Inspector Parker, who's one of my favorite characters because he's just the plodding, I do my police work the way it should be done. He does all the boring stuff that Lord Peter doesn't want to do. And he's not a genius. He's not the person who has these great insights, but his job is incredibly important. And so I love that we have those characters as well, where yes, we have the genius, but he wouldn't be the genius if he didn't have this support system and other people doing their jobs in very ordinary kinds of ways.
That is a good place to end our conversation. Thank you so much, Tiffany and Christine.
Thank you
for talking about a fantastic book. I recommend this book. If anybody wants to start by studying Sayers, read this book by Christine Colón, and with essays contributed by other Wheaton faculty, Choosing Community, Action, Faith, and Joy in the Works of Dorothy L. Sayers. Thank you.